All right, I think we're ready to go. Let's see if I can advance this. Am I advancing them? Okay. All right. I went too far. There's my title. All right, so the most important thing for you to keep in mind here as we get started is that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, right? And I think the message was we could go to 12:20, but like if we stop at 12:18, I want lots of credit for getting you to lunch 2 minutes early. Of course, if I go over, I shouldn't have said any of that to start with. I'm really glad to be here. We mentioned last night that this was for the men, so I'll throw out a few extra comments here for the women that weren't part of the men's session. This is a pleasure to do these studies, spend this time with you. Marty and I, for a longer story, have ended up doing this. I think I've counted up somewhere between 15 and 18 places that one or both of us have gone to talk about elders. But when I'm done, when the weekend is over, I'm not always sure what effect we had on the group. Sometimes there's a very tangible effect. We can think of some churches that didn't have elders and later appointed elders right after that process. Sometimes it's not that clear. But for me personally, I know that I'm going to grow and be strengthened by it. And what a pleasure to be with other elders and other teachers that we don't always get an opportunity to be exposed to. It's helping me a great deal. But we're going to talk about shepherding the stubborn. And I think you know right away that the idea of the stubborn probably is a smaller set of those weak and wayward members. It'd be hard to say that the stubborn aren't weak, aren't struggling in some way or another. So we need to be a little bit more specific about what we're going to talk about. So here's my personal definition for what we mean by stubborn. I'm thinking about, first of all, these are Christians. These are members of the body that you're concerned with. And we're not talking about the stubborn out there in the world or somebody in our family that doesn't care about Christ and they're just stubbornly resisting the gospel. That's a different kind of discussion. We're talking about those who actually are in some way or another participating with the body. They're members, but they are firmly committed to some attitude or some behavior that's destructive to them personally. It's not helping them. It's not helping them spiritually. It's not helping their relationship with God. Or maybe I should say, or it's harmful to others around them. And you can sometimes see somebody, whatever they're doing is really just harming themselves, and they're not willing to make that change. But oftentimes this stubbornness is having an effect on the group or on some circle around that person. And we need to be thinking about that as shepherds. What can be done in that regard? I thought it might be good to think quickly about some Old Testament thoughts or examples of what stubbornness is. God describes the whole nation. Now, we're going to try to talk again about sheep, about individuals who are stubborn. But God had to deal with like this whole nation. And at times, as a group, they were just stubborn. But this language here, I think, is a little bit helpful. This is what Nehemiah, praying, speaking to God, was saying about the people that God had to deal with. You warned them in order to turn them back to your law, yet they acted presumptuously and did not obey your commandments, but sinned against your rules, which if a person does them, he shall live by them. And they turned a stubborn shoulder, stiffened their neck, and would not obey. I just get almost the physical imagery that helps me think about individuals that we might work with as shepherds who are stubborn. You know, they turn the shoulder. It's almost like they're already getting ready for whatever you're bringing to them, man. They're just going to stiffen that shoulder, turn that stubborn shoulder. They're stiffening their neck. They know something's coming. They just don't want to hear it. They don't want to know about it and all. And there's just a refusal to obey or to do something that would be in their benefit and perhaps beneficial to others. You can think about some individuals. Anybody in the Old Testament come to mind that had that kind of stubborn attitude, refused to do something they were told to go and do? Jonah. Yeah, Jonah's that's the one I was thinking of. You know, God says, go do this. and he just runs off somewhere else, and you see the consequences of what he's doing. But I also think even about somebody like David, after he had sinned with Bathsheba, and then all the other things that he's doing to kind of hide the consequences of what he had done. There had to be some stubbornness in this. I mean, he's like committed down this path that's the wrong way to go. And so you can think about the prophet coming and talking to David. That would be a helpful example, I think, of how do you deal with the stubborn, where he finally like makes David see the consequences of what he's doing. So a lot of lessons we could take from there. But I thought it might be helpful just to kind of list. We've gone to a number of scriptures. I'm going to go to some more in a few minutes, but maybe if we could spend a few moments just trying to picture some different people. And I'm going to, these are nobody I know for the most part. There's a couple of these. And certainly, I don't know anything about your story. So when I put one of these up here and you go, he's talking about me. Somebody said, no, for the most part, this is a list that goes way back and it was put together a long time ago. So here's one. What about a new Christian who's got a lot of zeal, but his zeal is beyond his real knowledge and wisdom, and maybe he's causing some damage. He's challenging the complacency that he sees of others who don't seem to have the same level of fervor that he has, and he's using some bad judgment among the people that he's trying to influence. He's just continually pushing the gospel in a way that you can see is actually counterproductive to what he'd like to accomplish and what he's demanding out of other people. Now, this is a tricky one, isn't it? Don't you see a lot of good things? Even some qualities there we would think, I ought to try to imitate that. But if in your working, they won't listen. The zeal is so strong that they won't listen to wisdom. Well, there's an element of stubbornness here that needs to be thought through. In some way or another, you want to turn this person into a more effective worker, one of those good workers. Take the good that they've got, but you've got to bring out in some of the stubbornness that's here. On the other hand, it's kind of almost the opposite picture. Here's a talented, knowledgeable man, but he's insecure. He doesn't have the confidence in his ability to go and to do certain work, and he could be of a lot more use in the kingdom, but it's hard to get this person to do that, to engage and to be part of the work. I suggest there is an element of stubbornness in that. It's like they're almost committed to their lack of confidence, their assurance that, no, I can't do these things, and so they're not being as productive as they could have been. A peripherally involved family. They show up for services and all, and they look like they're really perfect in every way, but you can tell from different, and we'll talk later on about how you sometimes see these things and know them. They're following trends and activities that in their life, what really motivates them is just pleasure, worldly pursuits, things for their children that are not the most spiritually minded things, and they need to be awakened out of that circumstance. Is there an element of stubbornness to that? A vocal, cynical single woman has increasing influence over several other women. And it may well be that doesn't have influence for doing anything wrong, but the cynical attitude, the negativity of that is discouraging others or causing them to question certain things. And that should be a cause of concern. Here's what sometimes happens within a church, especially a smaller group. There may be a family that, because of the economic support that they're providing there, somehow or another have reached a point where they seem to have a little more power. And in that power, their thinking and influence and pushing for things really are more secularly minded than spiritually minded. What do you do in a circumstance like that, where you've got a family committed to ideas that are really counterproductive? Here's a few more, and we'll talk about how to address some of these. There's a long-time Christian, attends every regular service. So, if worship is at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, or Bible classes at 9, they're there for that. If it's the regular thing, if you print out your cards and say, here's when we meet, well, they're there. But anything extra is like, well, you know, I've got my work life, I've got my family time, I've got this time. You know, you're asking a lot more than what's really required. Is this something that everybody's supposed to do? You ever had that question? You know, are we all expected? Anything extra, don't want to do that. And I think there's some stubbornness in that. Again, this is that kind of stiffening up against a change in their life that would actually be good for them. If there's something extra like this weekend study, I guess since y'all are all here, nobody here is stubborn, so that's great, you know, at least not according to this. But all these other things could be beneficial to them and to others, and they're missing it. But here's one. This goes right to the heart of some of what Mark was just talking about. A sister refuses to associate with a fellow member because that member once said some really unkind things about her or about her family, or you can fill in the blank of what it is, the grudge that's been created. And she just does not want to have anything to do with this other sister. And even though there have been efforts, multiple efforts by that member who did the wrong, he says, you know, I know I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done it, but there isn't this forgiveness. And it could be worse than this. It could be a husband or a wife dealing with the same kind of a lack of a forgiving attitude. A young man is just, he seems to be unaware of the damage that a relationship in his life has. He's dating this unbelieving girl, and she's having a lot of influence over him, and he just doesn't seem to see that. You kind of figure out why he's struggling with that. And so he doesn't want to listen about the damage that the relationship's doing. How do you deal with that? The stubbornness perhaps he has in being unwilling. And then here's one more. The tough kind of situations that you sometimes come across. A recent widower. So you can sympathize. Here's all the compassion for this man. But he's got a drinking problem. And worse than that, the way that that's come to light is because one of his children has discovered it, but he just won't deal with it. Would elders have a responsibility to try to figure out what to do about this man, how to help him? As you think back over the 9 kind of examples, you see how they range from some things that maybe are some minor corrections you need to get out of the heart of this person who's stubborn, but some other things are almost like this is the snatch them out of the fire. That the consequences that are going on are so much more dire. But what I want to make sure that we understand from the beginning is that those individuals that we just put up and others who would fit into a category of being stubborn, that's the responsibility of shepherds. And I appreciate from the very beginning some things that Carrie said and that both Marty and Mark this morning have stressed. And I know that Ezekiel 34 has come up a couple of times, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. I guess I shouldn't apologize for doing it. I do remember somewhere, my wife is a teacher, both of our sons spend a time teaching, our daughters-in-laws are teachers. I'm just surrounded by all these teachers. So people like to tell me what you're really supposed to do when you're teaching class. But one of the things that helps learning is repetition. So if I repeat something they said, you should compliment me because obviously that's a good teaching tool to get back to this. But a couple of things real quickly about Ezekiel 34. For me as an elder, I get nervous when somebody turns to Ezekiel 34. If it's been a while since I've looked at it and thought about it, I know that by the time we're finished with the discussion, I'm not going to feel good. Because there's this picture of those shepherds who aren't doing their job. In some way or another, there's going to be some self-reflection, and I'm going to realize some things that I've failed to do. What God is doing in Ezekiel 34, again, is He's saying, look, you're not taking care of the sheep. Now, there's some things like you're not feeding the sheep. You can think of the whole flock. You're not getting them over to a good place where they're learning spiritually, learning the word, or actual sheep. The whole flock's able to feed. But then it begins to go into all these individuals, some of whom I'd suggest to you are stubborn. Now, the weak you've not strengthened, so that kind of fits what Mark was talking about. You should have done that. The sick you haven't healed. Well, that would definitely be the weak. You know, they've been damaged some way. They're sick. We talked about some of that. The injured you've not bound up. And I don't know that we would say that every sick or injured aren't somehow somewhat responsible for the circumstance that they've gotten in. Maybe they are. But then I began to think about some of these others. I think these others are beginning to fit that picture of somebody who's stubborn. They've strayed. There's a place where they should be, and they're not there. They're out of step or unruly, as you were defining some of those things earlier, Mark. They have wandered away, and we need to recognize that. And oftentimes the strayed, you know, they like it better wherever they are than where they ought to be. Or they're lost. And if, think back to that list of those 9. Some of those were just earnest people who had some stubborn traits that you need to kind of help to. But people who will not forgive, you remember the emphasis made even in the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer, about the need. If we want to be forgiven, we've got to be people who are willing to forgive. I'd suggest to you that perhaps that person is actually lost because of their stubbornness and unwillingness to. So who's going to go deal with that? Who deals with the lost sheep? It should be the shepherd. And they were scattered because there was no shepherd. There was nobody who was saying, who was going out there searching them out. Who's going to take responsibility for members who are stubborn? It ought to be the shepherds. And I think we've been kind of making that point pretty clear. Of course, and we're going to go to John 10 in a minute. I want to give you some examples out of Jesus, and that was a reference made this morning too, that he's really the good shepherd. In Ezekiel 34, God spends a moment to say, you know what, you leaders here in Israel, you shepherds, you're not doing your job. I'm going to do it. And he pictures that he is the good shepherd. And of course, his son coming and dying for us and the things he's done is truly the good shepherd. But this picture then of God is kind of the opposite of all of these. And I'm thinking again about those that we've now described in that list who maybe they're stubborn. He's going to seek out and rescue the sheep who've been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness. God is the one who's going to go and take care of us in those moments when we really are broken, but also when our own stubbornness has put us in a place where we need to be rescued. He'll seek the lost. He'll bring back those that are the strayed and all. So we see this wonderful picture then of the Good Shepherd. And there's some other things too that I would say relate more to those that are the weak. Wow, it just goes down over the whole thing. All right, let me catch back up here again. Past God. All right, one more passage then that's kind of this intimidating responsibility. We've mentioned this before too. So this definitely is repetition. Marty referred to it as the lucky chapter, Hebrews chapter 13. But think about the personal accountability that shepherds have as they're watching over the souls of others that they're going to give an account. And among those, excuse me, that they need to be concerned about are the stubborn. We're going to have to give an account even for those that we might otherwise, well, with the stubborn, I think particularly, we're tempted to just say, enough's enough. I'm going to wash my hands of this. Those that are especially weak, have been hurt by somebody, my heart, my compassion kind of like immediately wants to respond to that. But oftentimes with those that are stubborn, we don't. But we need to, because we're going to give an account is the point for those that are the shepherds. All right, well, let's think for a moment. Where would a shepherd go, an elder? Where would you go to try to begin to understand how am I going to deal with these kinds of people? How am I going to deal with a lot of the things that we've been talking about this weekend as far as who we might could use as an example to tell us what elders should do? I really have always wanted there to be like, 1 Peter chapter 6 or Ephesians chapter 7, the chapter that's devoted to and gives the example of how elders behaved in the first century So I can look at that and say, okay, that's what oh, great, this is great. Here's my template. That's what I'm going to go and do. There isn't one of those. Now, in 1 Peter 5, Peter says to the elders, oh, this is good. So elders are being addressed. It sounds like, oh, and he says he's a fellow elder. Oh, this is great. Now I got an example. It's Peter. But the examples and things we learned about Peter aren't really in his role as an elder. And so I kind of lose out a little bit of that as well. Who's my example? But in that chapter, Peter refers to Jesus as being the good shepherd. And Jesus himself refers to himself as being the good shepherd. And so if I'm an elder and I think of the role as acting as a shepherd to the sheep especially, then I ought to look to Jesus as an example of that. And he says some things I think are very instructive and helpful to every man who's going to serve as an elder. He says, the sheep hear his voice. It's Jesus referring to a good shepherd. He calls his own sheep by name. He leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. It's that individual one-to-one relationship that we've been talking about. They know him. He knows them. He knows them by name. And it's not just saying, well, he's accomplished what he needs for the sheep because he's got the specific name. Wow, I kept wondering if his name was John or Bob, but man, I got the right one, you know. And I'm in good shape because I called him by the right name. No, there's this intimate knowledge of the person, what's going on, that's implied here in knowing them. I know my own, and my own know me. I'm available to them. They understand my character. They're able to see it. And so there is that kind of a relationship. I would suggest to you that a good study is of Jesus as an elder's role model. And I think I'll just go ahead and put up all of these, and I'll try to make this point. I'm only going to mention, here we go again. If we go too far, it goes back to the whole beginning. I got to know where to stop. Okay. That just says I don't know what my last one is, right? That's on me. One of the things I think is particularly instructive for elders is to think about what Jesus did in his ministry. Now, a lot of times when we think about Jesus and we picture the things that we learn from the four gospel accounts, we picture him dealing with enormous crowds, right? He's feeding the 5,000, which was done after he had been preaching to them. And you got the 4,000, and you've got that scene in Capernaum where they're just coming one after another into the dark part of the day. The crowd's coming to be healed, and they're following everywhere he goes and all. And when he comes across the widow of Nain, he's got a big following with him, and he runs into another. It's always these crowds kind of going on, right? But there are lots of times where Jesus just stops and deals with somebody on a one-to-one basis. What a blessing that must have been for those individuals who had those moments of time when they were just with the Master, with the Good Shepherd. And elders need to be willing to carve out that kind of time on a one-to-one basis. But what I find instructive is how did he deal with these individuals? Now, they're not all stubborn, so I really shouldn't spend our time because we won't get to lunch. Well, if I tried to go down through the whole thing, because my topic is just the stubborn. Here are a few I think are stubborn. I think the rich young ruler was definitely fit into that. And he didn't even understand it. He comes to Jesus and he's looking for something that was missing in his life. Do you remember what it said about how Jesus felt toward the man? What did it say about that? Yeah, he had compassion. It says he loved him. He loved him. Okay? Now, the man asked, what do I need to do to inherit? Jesus asked him some questions. Is this a good man? Does he have a lot of traits? Could we have complimented him for a lot of things? Absolutely. I think it doesn't seem like whatever he said was not true. He was engaged in a lot of things. What did he need? What was the need that this man had?
Lord first.
He needed the Lord above everything else, right? He needed to hear that. He needed to know that there was something in his life standing between him and God. There are a lot of individuals, and this fits, I think, well with the picture of stubbornness, who are covetous, which is idolatry. And they don't understand that there's something in life that matters more to them than God does. They may see it, they may not. But if they don't see it, especially an elder needs to help them recognize you're putting this thing in life, your job, your ambition, your education, your fun, your money, whatever it is, your family maybe even, you're putting that above your service to God. This young man was stubborn. He didn't know that. And Jesus told him the truth and what he needed to hear. Did it work? Apparently not. I mean, didn't hear. The man goes away. He's grieving over it. It's like he got the truth of his circumstance, but he wasn't willing to make the right decision. Do you think Jesus grieved over that? Of course he did. And sometimes in dealing with the stubborn, you give them exactly what they need to understand, and it doesn't go anywhere. The next one, though, this demonic, so there's three I've highlighted here that we'll focus on as stubborn. Now, it's hard to say that he was stubborn because he was literally possessed by a demon. He wasn't in his right mind. And so there's a little bit of an analogy here to get to somebody who's stubborn. Not so much that was his circumstance there, but the lack of a sound mind oftentimes comes back to some issues that an individual has that they need to address. There are things that could be standing in their way. It could be their depression. It could be an addiction. Think about that ninth example we gave of somebody who's stubborn. Here's somebody who's struggling with drugs or alcohol or something, and they're not doing the right things about it. They may be saying some of the right things. They may really wish they weren't in that condition anymore, but they're not doing it. Is there a place for an elder to go to someone and to insist, you must get this kind of medical or other help to deal with this thing that's standing between you and truly following God? Would that be an appropriate thing to ask? We had that circumstance once. We had somebody in a situation, and we finally told them, if you must call, they had an access to counseling through their work circumstance. But you must use that or something else. You must prove that you are taking steps to deal with this addiction problem. And if you don't do it by this certain point in time, we are going to have to call this out publicly. That's the last thing we ever wanted to do. But what were we to do? If they don't do that, they're not coming out of this circumstance. And so in this case, of course, Jesus just had the ability. He just healed the man. But there's something more to it. What about when the stubborn turn the corner? When now they're taking some of those steps and they're beginning to realize, and you see that, oh, this is great. And so you just kind of put, you're done. I did my part. And we got him on the right path. What did Jesus, this man who had been possessed with the legion of demons, when Jesus is leaving that area, because he wasn't staying very long at all, what did that man want to do? Oh, and we were talking about that this week, saying our work. I just picture he's grabbed hold of Jesus' knees, and when they got to the boat, he's still being dragged along, because I wouldn't want to give up. I'd be frightened and nervous, and we need to know that. But Jesus had confidence in him too, that this man, what he needed was to be busy. And sometimes what elders have to do, especially with those who begin to turn the corner from a lot of the things you were talking about earlier, you need to help put a plan together. You know what? You need to get up every day. By this time, you need to be busy doing this or this. There need to be some activities. Engage them. Give them new work within the body of Christ, ways that they can help others. somebody who has recovered from addiction, that stubbornness and all, is a valuable person in the kingdom of God. Tremendously valuable. The ability to bring somebody else who's struggling and refusing and doesn't have the hope that they can do it, and you can bring them to that brother or sister, that's great. And they need to know they have a very valuable place. And finally, just jumping down in our list here of this, you've got Simon the Pharisee. And this is Luke chapter 7. I love this scene. Jesus has gone to the home of Simon. Simon, he's one of those Pharisees who thinks, you shouldn't have anything to do with the weak or the sinful and people who aren't like him, because he's completely convinced of his own self-righteousness. There is a woman in that scene, that's the one we're not so much talking about here, who needs to be forgiven. She is a very sinful person, to the point that anybody that saw her or coming into the house and all, nobody doubted, everybody knew just how sinful this person is. Now you would think that Jesus would spend most of his time talking to this woman. He says almost nothing to her. He says to her, "You're forgiven." He comforts her. He gives her what she needs there. But he spends most of his time talking to Simon, because Simon's stubborn. Simon is hypocritical. Simon's the one who really needs it. And do you know how he dealt with him? He contrasts things. Tells them this, he points out the difference between what Simon has done and what the sinful woman has done. Her love, concern, care for Jesus versus Simon's basically neglect, just half-heartedness. He contrasts it to him. He talks about the idea of being forgiven. Who would it be that would be most inclined to be grateful? One who's forgiven a little bit or one who's forgiven a lot? In other words, he uses analogies and stories. He makes comparisons. He does whatever he can to try to get to the heart of Simon. That's what you got to do with those that are stubborn. Sometimes you've got to point out the error of their ways by bringing other stories. And we mentioned David as perhaps being stubborn. Isn't that really what Nathan did? He kind of, through the back door, got him to suddenly put a mirror up and see himself and what he had done in an unexpected way. That's oftentimes what you have to do with those that are stubborn. Here's another example. This is the Apostle Paul. We've mentioned several times in Acts 20. He's making it clear that he was an example to them, but particularly an example to those elders in dealing with the weak. And the stubborn are part of the weak. We've got our narrower little description here. But I wonder about Paul in regard to this role model. There's this passage in 1 Thessalonians 2, also mentioned by Marty, I think, this morning, where Paul says that when he was among those of Thessalonica, he was like a mother to them and like a father. And that's an interesting way of describing this, that you can kind of pull out of this the fact that when I was among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her children, affectionate and all. You get the picture of the mother. But he also makes it clear that he was like a father, verse 11. Like a father with his children, how we exhorted each one of you, encouraged you, charged you. Let me just put up kind of a list here. These are some things he says as far as a mother: the gentleness, the affection, the sharing the gospel, the giving of oneself that he mentions in this. Do you think that these are some of the qualities, perhaps, that you might need to have if you're going to go deal with the stubborn? Those of you that are mothers, you ever have any stubborn children? Any of them act in some way that, how did you handle that? And I think that elders and shepherds should think about the way that mothers have dealt with their stubborn children. That they continue to love them and show them affection, and they give up. It's hard to deal with those that are stubborn. You're going to have to make some personal sacrifices in working with them. So there's a giving of that. But I was also thinking of this phrase that in that acting like a mother, he had shared the gospel. I think part of that is this hope y'all have been mentioning. It is really important for somebody to begin to get a picture of another day in life, a later time in life, when whatever this thing is that they're struggling with today, what if you overcome it? What if you're made into the new man and you're not like that anymore? And mothers particularly are good at presenting those kinds of things, and we need to emulate that. As a father, of course, he talks about laboring and toiling day and night. There's this diligence in this circumstance. I'm just not going to give up on you yet. I'm going to stay with this and trying to help them through. It's the example that you have to set. You have to think about, what have I done? What am I doing in this relationship and trying to help with this stubbornness that maybe is counterproductive? What are they seeing in my life that maybe is reflective of some similar conduct that I'm trying to get out of them? I need to be honest about it because I need to be holy and righteous. But then there's the idea of exhorting each one. I think you have to give them the motivation to do the right thing. Why is it so important? Remember back to our list, some of those didn't maybe seem all that important. Here's the man who's just kind of reserved. He could do more, but he's just hesitant to that. He's nervous about it. He's insecure. And you're confident he needs to do more. Well, the exhorting is this motivation, the good that will come out of it. It's kind of finding within his heart a desire to do even better. Well, that's what fathers sometimes are really good at, exhorting that, encouraging. It was talked about already this morning. And then there's just charged. You need to stop doing this right now. This is important. So there's that kind of stronger language that you need to figure out. When do I do that? When is that important? All of this is useful. So let me kind of draw some of this toward a close. Well, I think this time if I go backwards. No, every time. I'm going to master this eventually, which means that I'll stop thinking I know best and I'll just obey the rules of the remote here. So this is up just a little bit early. What I wanted to say before you saw the passage. I think one of the best tools, so we get to some practical advice here and trying to wrap this up. One of the best tools that elders have in dealing with those that are stubborn are other members. It's absolutely essential. And as Mark pointed out, sometimes you even kind of need to recognize that in this circumstance, I could go and talk to the person, but this individual that I know has tremendous influence over them, has been this mentor to them or example, whatever it is, they may not be an elder, but that person is the one who really needs to tell them. And oftentimes I've found that some of the work that I've done as an elder hasn't been necessarily the things that I went and did and talked to somebody. It might be how I gave that responsibility to someone else to say, okay, you really need to go talk to them. They're not going to listen. You're the one that can do that. I'll just say as an aside, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so valuable to have a wife serving along with you in this capacity. Because a lot of times the person that I've said, you're the one that needs to go do this, you're the most effective, is Kay. And it's like, I'm delegating over her because I know in that circumstance, she's really the one who's got more influence. Maybe it's a woman that just needs to hear this from another woman in the moment. But that's part of the work as well. And so elders should be appreciative. But you understand this is a two-sided thing, right? That elders can't do that work unless members are willing to also engage in reaching out and helping to look at those that are weak and struggling and scattered and lost and wayward and all these other words that we've used, or as Paul said to the Galatians, somebody who's caught in any transgression. And he says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watching yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so what you have here is this picture that anybody that's spiritually minded, the spiritual, should be looking around and seeing those that are stubborn and doing what they can already. But elders especially should be leaning on them. And I would suggest to you, most of the time, the way that you learn about somebody who's maybe got an attitude of stubbornness, but you don't see the behavior that clearly, it's somebody who's closer to them. who can come and engage with the elders to tell them about that. Here's another passage I think has been mentioned already today. I know it has because I wrote it on my notes. Marty mentioned, so that means yes, it was mentioned. But what I wanted you to notice in this, and Mark mentioned it as well. In the middle of this passage, let me point this out. You've got the leaders, right? You're respecting those who labor among you and over you. And we've kind of said as a group, we think that that's a reference to the elders. So here's the work of the elders, verse 12, and the way that people should esteem them highly because of their work. So elders, up to this point right here from verse 12 down, we're talking about their work, the things that they're supposed to do. On both sides of that is a description of everybody else. But what everybody else is doing is kind of engaging in the same kind of activity as the elders. You see that? Encourage one another and build one another up just as you were doing. That sounds like elder work to me, but it's everybody. Everybody's supposed to be doing it. And then when he finishes this part about their work, the leaders' work, be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, and then this is the list that Mark went through, that elders certainly have a responsibility to do it, but as he pointed out, everybody does. Right? So just a practical thing for elders is to always be mindful of that. Okay, so here's a few other things. I'm just going to put this as, this is the practical side of this. And I didn't go and try to find the farthest seat back and see if you can even read that smallest writing. You got it? That's pretty good. I'm not sure I could from back there. These are just some things that we've put together that kind of are reflective of when we say that elders are responsible for individual sheep. Here's some tasks and some things that elders should be doing all the time in trying to deal with individual sheep, stubborn or not. This is a broader list, but I just want you to try to think through a few of these as they might relate to those that are stubborn the way that we've talked about it. So in the first place, there's this need to be watching all the time for the spiritual dangers that might exist in a member's life, and look also for the opportunities to try to remedy them. Well, how do you do that? So that's kind of the check mark things here. There's all kinds of things elders are busy with. They need to get to know every member and to be thinking about and assessing, not just, man, that was a great meal with them. I really enjoyed that. It was good to find out that they're an Alabama football fan, because that's really who you should pull for, by the way. And that's a great thing. We had just the best meal, but come away without having learned something about them that's useful. I think when you meet somebody new as an elder, learn their conversion story. How did they come to know Christ? Find out their family circumstance. They may be the only Christian in their whole family. You think that's an influence? You think that's got an effect on them? All those kinds of things you want to know. So assess their background and their weaknesses and all. But also look at what they can do. You know, what are they able to do? Maybe you learn about some skills and some things that they have. I didn't know you were able to do that. And that can be something that can be useful to everybody. So you're trying to kind of think through. But also at the same time, you're paying attention to and seeing some of those poor life decisions. You talked about that this morning, Marty, about how important that is to recognize early on with somebody. If you're going to create these good workers, to see those things early on, well, this kind of gets to the heart of that stubbornness, that you're seeing some of these bad decisions that are happening, and you need to have an awareness of it. But beyond that, it's important to provide some teaching and some counseling, to be willing to have those discussions, those difficult conversations about the needed life changes. And sometimes you're just trying to understand the reasons and why it is, the excuses. We need to listen. Why is it that you continue to do? Well, they may have what in their mind is a perfectly justifiable reason. Until I understand and hear that, I'm really not going to know how to begin to influence them to stop doing that. And so we're trying to do that, but we need to provide warnings and advice. And I think this is especially important. Describe the desired behavior and benefits to them. One of the things that when we work with couples that are having difficulties within their marriage, one of them has harmed the other, and there's this need for forgiveness and restoration of the relationship. And there's a statement that they're committed to trying to do this. But there's so much discouragement in all that. The relationship that you were counting on has fallen apart. It's not what it needs to be. One of the most important things to say from day one as you begin to deal with them is to help them picture a time past where we are right now, where all the pain and hurt is so emotional and so deeply felt, and try to picture a time when you're past that, but you've done the right thing. And if you've done the right thing in forgiving one another, remaining faithful to one another, what will that mean to other people around you? And if you can get them to picture that, and you can do this in almost any kind of bad conduct that's going on, picture no longer doing this. And what will it mean to others that you can? That one day, maybe even one day your children grow up and they find out about all the difficulties y'all had as a couple in your earlier age, but they suddenly realized how you forgave each other, cared about each other, worked hard to overcome those weaknesses. What a legacy that would be. But you got to picture that. Sometimes you have to be the one who paints this picture for them of something good, the ideal that would be there. All right, and then finally, let's do this last set of these. You need to provide some opportunities for personal growth. We said like that man, the demon-possessed man that Jesus had healed, he needed to be put to work. He needed some activity. He needed things to fill in his life again. And the elders are ones that particularly need to find ways in which they can provide the training and other opportunities for those individuals to grow. A couple of other thoughts on these tasks I think are important. I know you screen new members, you need to watch for these spiritual dangers. We talk a lot, we were talking about addiction as a problem. Marty and I often mentioned a young man who came and told us in placing membership back when Marty was still an elder, and he said, look, I'm a recovering addict from this drug. I'm in a good place right now, but I just want you guys to know this from the beginning. I've had this problem. Okay. We weren't all that proactive in dealing with that. And like 2 years later, we get this call. I'm having to check into this clinic and deal with this problem. Shame on us. We hadn't done more proactively to it. There's a longer, very positive story to all of that, but nevertheless, I feel like we failed because even though we screened it, we didn't do anything with it. But you want to screen and know these things. And then finally, sometimes we just need to go farther. It's not enough for just us. We need to involve the whole congregation in trying to deal with that. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we talk about protecting the flock. But if I stop now, it's 12:18 and I get my 2 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. I really appreciate all of your attention as the third discussion of the day.
We really appreciate this time that we've been able to spend with teachers and looking forward to more lessons after lunch. I want to mention just a couple things before we break for lunch, and then we'll have Jason lead us in a prayer. First of all, many of us will be gathering at a Chinese buffet. It's the Fortune Star Chinese Buffet in the Miracle Mile Shopping Center. So they're going to have some space reserved for us there if you'd like to join us there, or you can go elsewhere to grab lunch if that would be better for you. But the space is supposed to be reserved for us starting at 12:30, so just be aware of that. I wanted to mention something else. Part of the value that we see in this time that we're able to spend together is not just the classes that we're having, not just these studies. Part of the reason we wanted four men and their wives to come is so that we could spend personal time getting to know them, gleaning from their wisdom. I'd encourage you in this extra time that we have at lunch, after the studies, tomorrow, spend some time getting to talk to these individuals, asking them questions. We'll, as we said, have an opportunity for panel discussion, encourage you to continue to turn in there. But take full advantage of this time that we have together. We're very thankful for the work that God has done, is continuing to do in these people's lives, and pray that we can glean from that. But at this time, we'll be led in a closing prayer, and then we'll break for lunch. Jason.
Thinking about a fairly large group of us that may be at the Chinese buffet, it might be difficult for us to say a prayer there together for our food. So maybe we'll think about that now, and we can already have that taken care of while we can hear one another. Yeah. So let's pray together. Our God and our Father, we are so thankful for your incredible love and grace. God, we're so thankful that you looked on us with such adoration, such love and compassion, and that you sought the restoration of our relationship with you. God, we're so thankful for that you have shown us your character and your will, that you have taught us the way that you designed for us to live, and that you have made a way for us to be restored to you, even though we have fallen and failed to be everything that you intended for us to be. God, we're so thankful that you demonstrated your character so powerfully in sending your Son to live as a man, to teach us, to show us your ways, and to sacrifice himself on the cross for our sins. We're so thankful for the good plan that you have for us to grow into maturity, to be like you, to take on your heart and your mind and your character. We're so thankful for your Spirit that you give us, that empowers us, enables us, and teaches us to be like you. And so, God, we thank you and we praise you for all that you've done for us. We ask that you continue to be with us and help us, continue to shepherd and lead us until we all grow to be more like you, and until we're all home with you forever. God, would you bless our time together over the meal that some of us will share? Will you bless the time together in your word, and help us all to be encouraged and drawn closer to you. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Might also be helpful to mention we're scheduled to start back at 2:20, so hopefully we can get lunch.